Hello, hello, hello. We're going to talk about a few of the miracles of Jesus today. One of the things that we talked about in the Axial Age, transition in Judaism, actually all over the world, but especially in monotheism, we see the beginning of this idea of cosmic dualism, that there's some kind of a battle going on between good and evil, between God and Satan, or in Zoroastrianism, as we studied, they called him Angramanyu or Ariman. But this is all axial age. And so there's also teachings about, the armies in each of these camps. And one of the popular versions in Judaism is that this highly ranking angel rebelled, as it were, and managed to deceive and take a third of the angels with him, and they become what are known today as demons. And that's the Jewish take on the story there. And so, as we said, these kind of doctrines, the ones involving the cosmic dualism, but also involving resurrection and heaven and hell and final judgment, all kinds of things, they're evolving over the centuries. So just in this area of angels and demons, what has kind of evolved over, 4 centuries or so until the time of Jesus is this idea of angels and demons. And by the time we get to the stories of Jesus's life in the Gospels, we will find out that in his generation, they had gotten to the point where they were blaming demons for just about everything. Now, we talked about the different sects in Judaism previously, and obviously this wouldn't apply to the Sadducees, mostly down in Jerusalem, because they didn't believe in this kind of stuff, but everybody else did. Demons are being blamed for all kinds of things, from sicknesses to antisocial behavior to whatever. Another thing, and Judaism is not the only place where there's the idea that there are evil spirits responsible for things, or any other kind of need for some kind of magical or spiritual deliverance, whether it's from physical ailment or whether it's from demonic possession. So miracle healers and exorcists casting out demons are multiplying. There's a bunch of them. And this actually becomes a vocation, again, not just in Judea, but in other places as well throughout the Roman Empire. There are people, that's what they do. And, they train their sons after them to be exorcists or whatever. And so healers are everywhere. And this is important to understand, because I'm going to talk first about the miracles of Jesus involving healing and exorcism, and I'm going to talk about them in a very general way because there's so many examples of it. But what I want to bring out is the common themes between them that I think might help us understand some things. So anyway, in the time of Jesus, there are other miracle healers. He's not the only one, but there are certain things that make him very, very different from the other healers. And so let's talk about a few of these differences, okay? First of all, the people that are in business to do this, who are their clients? People with money, right? You've got to pay for these kind of services. And they would keep on performing rituals, I'm sure, as long as you had money to pay for them. We see in one story that we'll get to later, there's a woman that is healed of some kind of blood disease, but it says that she spent everything on physicians. Maybe at one time she was fairly rich or a woman of means, but she'd spent everything paying people that were supposed to be able to treat her. And we're talking about what's called physicians. Even according to medicine today, some of what's called physicians back then is kind of quackish. But when you get into the exorcism and the healing thing, it gets even more so. And so that's the first thing. This is something that rich people can afford. How often is it successful? Even today, when you look at miracle healers, it can be difficult to validate, how successful it is. I have no idea how successful these guys are, but they must manage to find business or they wouldn't be in the business. So one of the things that's very different about Jesus is he's not charging anything. He's not doing this for money at all. In fact, he never asks for money. in any sense, in any way whatsoever. So for Jesus, poor people who don't have any money, they're thrilled because Jesus seems willing to do this kind of thing, for anybody. Next, we talked about how these professional healers or exorcists or whatever will probably keep on performing rituals until the time you run out of money, okay? But the idea here that makes this work is that, healing can be difficult. Exorcism can be really difficult. I don't know if any of you watched the original movie. Seems like it must have come out around 73 or something, but it was called The Exorcist. It was the first one. And I was actually living very close to where they shot the movie, so we would go and see the movie set and stuff when they were filming there. And when the movie came out, we went and we saw it right away. But it was a funny thing. I think it was a Gallup poll, but there was a poll that showed that right after the movie came out, church attendance went up. I mean, Protestant, Catholic, church attendance just went up. That movie kind of scared the crap out of people. And since then, there hasn't really been a better exorcism movie made, I don't think. But The Exorcist was crazy. And so my question here is, is exorcism easy? No. I mean, this ritual goes on throughout the whole movie, and both of the priests involved in the exorcism die. So exorcism is not easy, and it can go on a long time. And so you can drag on these rituals and obviously make a lot of money. So the second thing that's very different about Jesus, the first thing, remember, was he's not charging anything. And the second thing is he does these things instantly. Boom, they're done. You don't have to have a long ritual. Now, there's a couple points on this I want you to get, but the first is just the time, okay? Second, we're going to have 3 points here that are important. The second is the permanence of the rituals. I mean, if the demons don't come back, or if they're cured of a disease, they're completely cured. And lastly, this is the third point, there doesn't seem to be any kind of ritual required. And remember, we've talked about different ideas about rituals, so this is kind of an important concept, Jesus doesn't have to do any kind of rituals. He doesn't need a magic ritual. So a lot of the other healers and exorcists are paying a lot of attention to him because, he's in their business and he is being more successful than anything they've ever dreamed was possible. So just speculation, they've got to be taking notice. I mean, if they could be as effective as Jesus, they could do a whole lot more business, and they're looking at him, certainly saying, well, how does he do it? And when you say, how does someone do it? You watch them do it. There's some kind of ritual. If you're fixing a car and you say, how do you, change the alternator? You watch the person do it. And that's the whole idea. But Jesus doesn't give them anything to see. He usually just says a few words and just goes, come out. And boom, the demon's out or the person's healed or whatever. So this must be frustrating. They can't figure out, how in the world he does this kind of thing. So he doesn't need any kind of ritual at all. That's an important thing too. I do think he has a sense of humor, and I'll tell you why. There's one ritual that he does that's never been done before. Now, Moses and Joshua, that's the first miracle anointing, they did all kinds of crazy stuff. And the second one, in the northern kingdom of Israel during this split kingdom, was the anointing of Elijah, and then after that, his sidekick Elisha. And, they control the weather and raise the dead and, stuff even Moses hadn't done. But Jesus does something that Moses and Joshua and Elijah and Elisha never did. He opens the eyes of people who are blind. Nobody's ever seen this before. So anyway, they've got to be paying, the other miracle healers have got to be paying attention. When he's opening the eyes of the blind, that's like, never seen this before. This is going to be of interest. And I think he's messing with them because the funny thing is he does this like 3 times that I remember, but every time it's like a different ritual. And there is some kind of ritual every time, but it's a totally different one. So Jesus opens 3 different guys' eyes that are blind, but he does a different ritual every time. And obviously he doesn't need a ritual, doesn't seem to need it for anything else. But I wonder if he's messing with, anybody who's trying to figure out how he does it. So these are some major differences in terms of how Jesus does these miracles. Again, he doesn't need any kind of ritual whatsoever. The power seems to be in him. So it takes a short period of time. It is completely effective, and he doesn't charge a dime. So this is way different than the businesses that are around, but it's important that you know there's businesses around, and we'll find this out. Jesus gets in trouble for doing miracles on the Sabbath day. I used to think, why did the leaders decide that it was too much work to do this particular kind of miracle on the Sabbath day? And that might make sense to a young kid sitting in Sunday school. But I realized later on, how in the world can somebody who doesn't know how to do a miracle decide how much work it is to do a miracle and then try to legislate over the miracle workers doing it? That whole concept is ridiculous. And I found out later on that there's a reason for that. There's something that made a whole lot more sense. And that is that healing and exorcism have become vocations. They're things that certain people get paid for doing. And you cannot perform your vocation on the Sabbath. In fact, even if you're doing it for free or in a different location, you still can't perform your vocation. In fact, even if it's somebody else's vocation, you still can't perform it on the Sabbath. That's the way it is. No vocational work. And so when healing and exorcism are a vocation, well, then Jesus is breaking the Sabbath. Now, you think, when he's doing miracles they've never seen before, why are they so worried about doing it on the Sabbath? And it's a very good question, by the way, if you're asking that. But it actually brings up another observation and question, and that is, if they are appealing to that, it must also be that the whole idea of doing miracles in the first place is making them very uncomfortable. So you're doing it on the Sabbath? Well, that's not okay. Oh, by the way, there's something even less okay. On the Sabbath, as you know, they meet in the synagogue gatherings, and Jesus will go into the synagogues, and he will sometimes do a miraculous healing or even an exorcism in the middle of the synagogue gathering on the Sabbath. So he's not just breaking the Sabbath, he's just, causing chaos in the synagogue. And the synagogue rulers, as they call them, leaders, whatever, they do not like being out of control. We're going to find out in one of the stories that there was one synagogue ruler that probably considered Jesus quite a pain in the butt, but later on ends up with a very different opinion of him when he needs his services. So what other kinds of healing are we talking about here? One of them that's interesting, actually two of them, are done from a distance. A man comes to Jesus one time, and it's his son that is very, very sick and looks like he's going to die. And then in the other story, I believe it is a centurion, if I remember right, and his servant is sick. But anyway, both of these guys have traveled to find Jesus. But Jesus doesn't go back to their house with them. He just tells them, okay, it's done. And they believe him, and they go home. And actually, they feel better about that. They don't feel worthy that he should come and, if he could just say a word and it wasn't too much trouble. But they believed it when he said the word. And so they go back, and then the next day when they get home or whatever, they find out that their loved one, son or servant, in whichever case, are fine. And they're told that the time they immediately improved was right at the time when he was hearing these words from Jesus, even though he was many miles away. We have instances where Jesus heals a man who cannot walk. In fact, this happens more than once, that he heals people that cannot walk and they're able to walk after that. He heals deformed limbs. He heals an issue of blood with another woman. And I won't go through all of them. If you're interested, send me a message and I'll send you a list of all of his miracles, and you can look them up real easy if you want to read them for yourself. And when we get to the teaching video, also, if you want to, read Jesus' parables, send me a message and I'll send you a list of all the parables and where they're at there, so you can do that on your own. Well, there's many, many times that Jesus teaches, and he's always outside of the town or outside of the city, and the people come out to him, and he'll pick some high mount to sit up on, and the people will spread out, and he'll probably, big barrel-chested guy with a, voice that could project, and certainly not the soft-spoken, Victorian actor, blessed are the poor, It's like the Monty Python movie, they make a big joke out of that because obviously they have to keep relaying the message from the front all the way to the back of the crowd because Jesus is talking all quiet and dramatic. And blessed are the peacemakers. By the time it gets to the back of the crowd, it's blessed are the cheesemakers. And there are actually a couple of rabbis there that are in a discussion about, is it just cheese or is it all dairy products in general, which is so funny if you understand how rabbis actually talk about these kind of things or how they did back then. So no, he's probably a big barrel-chested guy that projects very well. Well, anyway, he is teaching a whole bunch of people in two of these stories here. And at the end of the day, it's going to be getting dark and people need to go back to their towns or villages or whatever. And but as they're sending them away, Jesus tells his 12 closest disciples, he says, give them all something to eat before they leave. And the 12 disciples are incredulous. I mean, the first time it says there's 5,000 men, and the second time it says there's about 4,000 men. So these are big crowds. And the disciples barely have enough food to feed them, if that. But Jesus blesses the food, tells them to start passing it out, and apparently it's multiplying in the baskets or something, because everybody gets filled. Again, 5,000 the first time, 4,000 the second time. And when they're done eating, and by the way, done eating means you can't cram anything else down your throat. These people are not rich. Some of them are in a situation where a good meal, hey, nobody's saying, I'm sorry, I'm working on my waistline. It's like, no, you eat everything that you can eat here. This is an opportunity you may not see again. So again, when they're done eating all they can eat, it says that they take back up baskets full, one time 12 baskets and one time 7 baskets full afterwards. They didn't even start with a full basket full to start with. So everybody eats, they're stuffed, and they're getting back more food than they started with as leftovers. So interesting. Let me tell you what's really interesting about this. And this is, again, a concept I want you to think about. Of all the miracles Jesus does, this is the one that convinces the people more than anything else they want him to be their king. This one. Not raising the dead or calming the storm or anything like that. This. A good meal. Now, this might seem silly, but you have to ask yourself, how many people are there? What percentage of the population has a demon they need exorcised from themselves or a loved one? Probably a very small percentage, right? How many people have some incurable disease that they're looking for a miracle for and, trying to hire some kind of a miracle healer? Very small percentage of the population, right? For those people, that's their ultimate concern. But for most people, that's not what they're thinking about. What are they thinking about? Day-to-day life. How am I going to eat my next meal? And so here comes a guy, and they can sit around and just listen to like, whoa, this is some deep stuff. And at the end of the day, get a meal like nothing they've had anytime recently. And this is what life is like when this guy is in control. They're like, he's going to be our king. In fact, it says that to get away from them, Jesus has to kind of disguise his looks or whatever and sneak away from them. By the way, he does this a couple other times too. He seems to be able to change his appearance. And there's one other story where he does it during his ministry, and then a story he does it after his resurrection. But anyway, he has to get away from them. Now, I started thinking about this. Food, yeah. What's the old saying? The way to a guy's heart is through his stomach. Well, I guess that's right. But not just guys, everybody at this point in time. So everybody has to eat. That's what I want you to get. Everybody has to eat every single day. That's what they would like their reality to be like. And this is not just a small percentage of people. This is everybody that's not rich that has this concern right now. So when you think of it that way, it makes a lot more sense why this is the miracle. They're like, he's the dude. We're going to put him on the throne right now. And he has to sneak away because that's not what he wants to happen at this point in time, obviously, or at any point in time, as we talked about in the prior video about messianic expectations. Let's talk about some control of nature miracles. There's 2 of them that happen out on the Sea of Galilee. It's actually the Sea of Tiberias, Sea of Kinneret, but it's renamed after Caesar Tiberius. And we just call it the Sea of Galilee today because it's the only sea in Galilee. So, as you remember, some of his disciples are fishermen, I mentioned before. And so they have boats. And Jesus is always traveling around. Many times he'll be going across the Sea of Galilee. And by the way, when it says, he's going across it, that doesn't always indicate one direction. It's kind of a really strange, if you're looking down on it, a backwards P shape, but there's all kinds of different ways that you can go across it from one point to another point. And but in both of these stories, they're going from one place to another place. And there's storms. Now, if you're involved in a fishing business here, storms happen and you know it. And there's no Doppler radar, can't watch the evening news. Probably not a lot of storms make it over all of the, ridges from the Mediterranean to this kind of a bowl called the Sea of Galilee. But when a storm does, it can be really whipping up the waves and stuff. And if you've been in a fishing business for a long time, you've probably lost a boat. I mean, this is, not going to be a strange experience, but there are probably people who have lost their lives. So when the wind starts picking up, you want to get off the water right away. Hypothetically, if you had 6 people in the boat, I mean, you might have 3 or 4 of them rolling like crazy. Well, 2 or 3 of them are like just, trying to get water out of the boat, bail water out of the boat. So anyway, both times something like this is happening. Now, there's one time where Jesus is not with them. And in the midst of the storm and the waves are coming into the boat, and they see this guy walking across the water towards them, and they start freaking out because they think it's a spirit, it's a ghost. And apparently they believe in ghosts, but Jesus calls out to them and tells them that it's he. And they let him in the boat. And there's a little more to the story than that. But when he gets in the boat, the storm is immediately gone. And they're at the other side where they were going. So, if you see Jesus hitchhiking or something like that, pick him up. You'll make really good time. And anyway, there's another time, too, where he controls the weather. And it's the same scenario, only this time he's with the disciples in the boat. He's actually taken off with them. And he's asleep in the back of the boat. And the storm picks up and the water's coming in the boat. And, he must be a really tired Messiah because I don't have time to show you a bunch of pictures of what the boats looked like. But it seems like he's at least going to be partially in the water if it's raining that hard to where water's coming in the boat. So he must be a really tired Messiah indeed if he's not waking up. But his disciples do wake him up and say, "Rabbi, we're perishing." And he gets up and says, "Where's your faith?" And he says, "Peace, be still." And the storm is immediately quiet. I find this interesting because in Mark and Matthew, they have this story. And the 2 adjectives that are used to describe the state of the disciples in one translation I have are astonished and terrified. Astonished, I get this, and terrified, I get this too. We are much more afraid of things that we don't understand. They've seen storms before. They've seen ships go down before. They may have seen someone die before, but they have never seen a guy with 3 words change the weather. And this scares the crap out of them. Who have we hitched our wagon to here? What if he gets mad at us next week? I find this interesting. We've gone from regular fear. I mean, I know this can kill me. I'm afraid. I'm familiar with this, to unfamiliar fear. Psychologically, this makes a lot of sense. Okay. Imagine some things that can kill us. Like, how about driving 70 or 80 miles per hour on a freeway? Now, if you'd never seen anything going that fast before, I mean, when cars first came out, someone would see someone going down the road 20 miles an hour and they'll be like, "Oh my God," oh my God. Now it's like, he's doing over 100. So obviously people die. Obviously that can kill you, right? If you'd never been in a car and you got in a car and started going that fast, you'd be terrified. But we're not. We know we could die in a twisted mass of metal at any trip we take, and yet we still get in the car. We have to. It's a fear we're used to. It's a fear we've learned to live with. And there's a bunch of them like that. And by the way, they vary wherever you live. We see some things on the TV, terrorist acts or whatever that scare the crap out of us because, it doesn't happen here. In Israel, occasionally there are terrorist attacks. They're usually small attacks. You see this on the news and it scares the crap out of you because this doesn't happen here. But we have stuff that happens here that doesn't happen there. Here's the deal, though. I think it's much safer walking around the streets in Jerusalem at night than it is in New York City. And but again, this is stranger to us, so it seems, a little bit more terrifying. If you grow up there, you're used to this, and the chances are still remote it would happen to you, but it could. And after high school, everybody goes into the Army. Guys for 3 years, girls for 2, last I heard. And they're all very proud, to serve their country. And this is just, the way it is. It's a different world. I mean, as soon as you get out of high school, here's your automatic weapon. What would it be like here if we gave, an assault rifle to everybody that graduated from high school? What would it be like in the United States of America? And you realize, wait a minute, our teenagers are not like their teenagers. They're different. They've grown up in a different situation. But here's what's funny. I think it was the first year that I was there in 2005 doing archaeology in the summer. I was walking down Ben Yehuda and somebody, pointed at a store and said, this where the bomb went off that killed those people or whatever. And the store's open again and just doing business. And something seemed weird. It's like, wow, people died there, but it's just a store. And so I started thinking about that. We had a horrible accident on Interstate 4 many years back. Some of you that are my students now, you were probably small children at the time, but it was over 50 vehicles, and it was early in the morning, if I remember right, where there was smog. We have fog here occasionally, as you know, but they had wildfires that were burning that particular year too, not too far away, and the smoke had mixed with the fog, and people couldn't see worth a darn, but they didn't slow down, and so they had this huge accident, but nobody turned I-4 into some kind of a monument or a memorial. As soon as they got done cleaning all the carnage off the road, they reopened the highway and people were driving 80 miles an hour again. And nobody thought it should be anything different. So that was the first thing I thought about. I'm like, yeah, makes sense, but it seems strange to me. Here's where it gets good. They found out that I lived in Tampa, Florida. Now, this is 2005, if I remember right. And they're like incredulous. It's like, why would you live someplace so dangerous? I'm like, what are you talking about? And they're like, the hurricanes, man. And I think it was the year right before that, wasn't it? We had 5 of them. Actually, we had 4 because one of them turned aside and went to New Orleans because you know how hurricanes love New Orleans. But anyway, they'd seen this, roofs being ripped off houses and boats flipping through the air and stuff. And they're like, what kind of an idiot would live in a place with weather like that? Well, they just met that kind of idiot and they wanted to understand what was wrong with us. Kind of like maybe some of you would wonder when you hear about a big earthquake in California and you say, who in the world would live there? And yet I lived there and, you just get used to that kind of stuff. Anyway, so things that are more familiar to you, those fears, you manage more easily. You've learned to at least be in denial or something. But something that's very, very strange to you is the kind of thing that is going to astonish and terrify you. Resurrections from the dead. Jesus, we already talked about one of them when we were talking about the sects. And I was talking about the things that Jesus had done to make the high priests and the Sadducee sect really, really angry and quite committed to the fact that Jesus needed to die now. That was a resurrection from the dead. And what was really unique about that was Lazarus had been dead and buried 4 days already. He's decomposing. Probably smells terrible. And but Jesus tells him to open the tomb anyway and raises him from the dead. Now, these people have never even seen a resurrection, except for a few that might have been it. There were 2 Jesus did before, which I'll tell you about. But they've never seen this. But the whole idea of somebody who is like decomposing and raised from the dead and he's fine, that's kind of trumps your average resurrection miracle, I would say. Actually, his final one trumps everything. He dies and he raises himself from the dead on the 3rd day. That kind of trumps everything. But there's 2 resurrection miracles before this. One of them, there is a widow whose only son has died. And there is a funeral procession coming out of the town of Nain. And Jesus sees the funeral and stops it and raises the widow's only son from the dead. This looks an awful lot like Elijah and Elisha, by the way, both of them in their ministries, raised the only son of a widow back to life again. And 2 different stories of that. So interesting. The other time is when I talked about the woman with the blood issue, but she's part of the story. So what's happening is they're coming back west across the Sea of Galilee back to Capernaum, where Jesus is kind of like home based, even though he travels all the time. And the synagogue ruler's daughter, his name's Jairus, I think, and his daughter is really sick. So he sent people to get Jesus to come back and heal his daughter. Now, again, he might have been pretty annoyed with Jesus's exploits in the synagogue earlier in Capernaum, where some of these confrontations took place. But his opinion of Jesus seems to have changed quite a bit now that he desperately needs him to heal his daughter. Unfortunately, Jesus is gone. So when he gets there, he's told, come to the rabbi's house. And but he can't get there because there's this huge crowd that he's trying to get through. And this woman comes up, and it says that she'd spent all her money on physicians trying to be healed of some kind of a blood disease. But she touches just the hem of Jesus's cloak, and she's immediately healed. And it's an interesting story. But anyway, all of this makes him late. So he doesn't get to Jairus' house in time, and his daughter actually dies. And so by the time Jesus gets there, they've already got the mourners out there, whatever, doing their thing. And Jesus says, she's just sleeping. And of course, they just like ridicule him, laugh him to scorn is the way they say it in the older versions. I kind of like that. Laugh him to scorn. I laugh at him to scorn him, because I think he's so ridiculous. So that's the way they treat Jesus. But Jesus actually goes up into the upper room where they've laid out her body. And says, Talitha Kumi, which means maiden arise. She rises from the dead. And so he tells the family, he says, don't tell anybody this. And he and his disciples leave. And then after they're gone, I'm sure everybody finds out, because when the girl walks outside and they all think she's dead, nobody has to tell them anything. They know what happened now, but Jesus is gone. And so the people that laughed at him and sneered at him and everything, they can't even say they're sorry. They feel like crap. He raised her from the dead and I mocked him and he's gone. They can't even say I'm sorry. I wonder what that would feel like. One last thing I'd like to mention, and that is some of the religious leaders actually challenge Jesus regarding where he's getting this power from. They don't want to admit that it's the power of God, the power of the Holy Spirit, because, Jesus has not really treated them with respect. He has not endorsed their ministry. In fact, some of them he's challenged. And so they don't want to endorse him either, but they say that the power is the power that he gets from the devils himself. He's casting out devils by the chief of the devils. Now, whether that means that the devils are divided among themselves or it's a stage show where he's arranged with the devils to act like they're being cast out. Whatever. They're basically saying that whatever you're seeing, it's not the power of God. And this receives a pretty strong rebuke from Jesus in a couple places. Apparently, when you see the power of God, the power of the Spirit of God, and you call it the spirit of the devil or of the demons, that's pretty darn blasphemous. And there has been a lot of debate regarding Jesus's rebuke of this, as to whether or not this is the unforgivable sin, the one thing that just can never be forgiven, because Jesus does say that the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven in this life or in the next one. So, only time that he actually says that. Everything else apparently can be forgiven. So there's many differences of opinion on that. In the next video, we're going to talk about Jesus's teachings. So I will see you then.